I'm going to be talking about fractures, which really doesn't really sit well, does it, with healthy aging? It's certainly not what you might want to hear, but it is so common. I think all of you will have come across people who have fractured. So just some facts and figures about it first. Now, I'll be very interested to see the same figures from Tilda and how it looks in Ireland. But as it stands, we know, anyway, I'll just give, this is the Women's Health Institute. It was the study in the States, longitudinal. They followed over 80,000 women for over 7 years. And it's really quite staggering. In 1 year, the number who had a fracture was greater than that for those who had breast cancer, MI, or stroke combined. So in a lifetime, that means about 1 in 5 men and about 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 women will have a fracture. So anyone you come across, if they haven't had, they're very likely to have at some point in their lifetime. So we should all know a little bit about it and be astute to it. The healthcare costs, the cost to the person, even for society and councils, litigation costs are enormous across the field for fractures. This is the inpatient bed days in Ireland. This is height data. And that's fragility fractures. So it really is quite staggering. So this is the admitted patients only. The number who are not admitted, at least another 50%. And these are the projections, okay? It's by age band. So in 2014, 12,000 number of hospitalizations for hip fracture. The projections, because of the aging demographics, and as Roseanne said, we'll all be aging more healthily, seemingly. That means there will be more people up, about, and mobile, more fractures. Over 31,000, so about a 2.5-fold increase. Hip fractures, we are the 6th highest in the world. So really, this is, you know, we have a huge problem ahead in Ireland, which is a consequence of the healthy aging, you could argue, but we really need to have a strategy to deal with it. So the good news is many fractures are preventable, and addressing bone health, falls risk, and I think importantly, the misconceptions around both, because that's crucial. And as Sean was talking about, exercise and getting people motivated and incentivized and understanding why they're exercising, it might help their uptake of it. Understanding why you're prescribing bone health medications. So that's a really important point. I won't go into drug details, but the biggest evidence base for fracture risk reduction, because of the huge number of clinical trials, is osteoporosis medications. If you have a T-score, which is on a bone density scan below -2.5, which is the diagnostic threshold for osteoporosis, there's an up to 70% reduction in fracture risk after 3 years. And that's across the board with pretty much all the drugs. For the other fracture types, less so than spine fracture, but it's still up to 50% if you take the medications. But it isn't all about T-score, because low bone density is only one of several fracture risk factors. And one of the big problems with getting people onto treatment was they're waiting for this DEXA scan that never happens. So now, really, if you have a high enough fracture risk, which is you've ever had a fracture before, you get on and get treated. And this just shows that if you give zoledronic acid infusion to those who have osteopenia, you will still have a significant reduction in fracture risk. So you're not going to do them harm, you will benefit. The lifestyle factors, very important, but as I say, the uptake of these is where education is key, which is where a fracture liaison service can put all of this together. Alcohol and smoking, nutrition, low BMI, you'll know those, underweight, especially if you've ever come across anorexic patients, they're overrepresented, as are the alcoholics on orthopedic wards. You'll have all come across them in dealing with any orthopedic or in your physiotherapy practice, etc. And weight-bearing exercise is proven to increase bone mineral density, but not to the same magnitude as the medications. It's all about, if you really want to stick to the evidence base, it is the medications that are key. Falls risk assessment, strength and balance exercises have at least 30% reduction in the risk of future falls. Again, if the uptake is there. Medication review, polypharmacy is huge, even from Roseanne talking about Tilda, something like only 2% of over 70-year-olds were not on medication or have a comorbidity. Many medications, perhaps unnecessary, and can be reviewed with falls and fracture risk in mind. So specifically about osteoporosis medications, this is one of the biggest problems that we face. And there are huge discontinuation rates. There's lots of bad press about these drugs. Side effect, and this doesn't just apply to osteoporosis drugs, but there's a presumption that if, you know, in reading this catalogue of side effects, it means they're actually going to get it. And that's not just amongst patients, Even GPs, doctors, I've had many patients who advise them, the GP said not to take that awful poisonous drug. And that's more than a few times I've heard that. So they're really often feared more than actually fractures themselves. But when you see this kind of thing, it's no wonder. There are countless headlines about these horrific side effects from these awful drugs. And if you even Google osteoporosis drug side effects, you're going to come across some articles that really, like the first one I circled, is about doctors and drug companies spinning the evidence, spinning the numbers to get you to take these expensive drugs. So there's a big problem here. This is a very interesting slide from Google search activity. This was on Fosamax, which is the trade name for alendronate. So ONJ is one of the very feared side effects, osteonecrosis of the jaw. And that big spike A was the Google search activity for this drug as a result of that. B was an association with atrial fibrillation that appeared in some of the media reports. And D was the atypical femoral fracture. It's not to say that these side effects can't happen. They can, although the AF has been pretty much ditched, really. That was in one single study only. All the minor spikes were landmark publications by the American Society of Bone and Mineral Research on guidance on, let's say, countering the story about atrial fibrillation, and they had no impact at all. So we are in a different age altogether where patients are really doing their own research. They're not really taking on board what we say. So even though we have good news, you really can reduce fracture risks, you can reduce falls. This is why, I mean, it should be straightforward. It should be quite easy, but why do we need a fracture liaison service to put it together? So I'll just give you an example of where I worked before, years ago. I did an audit on fragility fractures down in our fracture clinic, looking at over and under 75-year-olds, because that was the guidance at the time from NICE. If you're over 75, you should be treated for osteoporosis with or without a DEXA. It's not necessary. If you're under, you should be having a DEXA scan, at least, if not treated. So there were the figures. Only 20% of those aged 50 to 75 were actually being screened or treated at all. So myself and a rheumatologist, we got a form, a big A4 sheet, put it on the front of every individual set of case notes. And we asked the ortho doctors, all you have to do is just tick the box, DEXA scan or clinic, just tick and sign. It was really very simple. And we went there regularly to reinforce it. We talked to everybody in fracture clinic, and there we go. There was a trickle of referrals initially, and this is just a few months later, and absolutely no impact. And this is in agreement with several studies in the literature showing that you cannot expect, you'll know what fracture clinics are like. They're mayhem. There's 100, 120, 30 patients a day in a fracture clinic. This is not the place. They're being seen for their fracture. So that was the grounds for a business case for a fracture liaison nurse that we had. So she sat in fracture clinic every day. Her task was to capture these patients and proactively screen them, and that's what's needed. There's no real other way around this. Anything else is a shortcut. So just interesting how you can start something up. It can all look great for a while. But of course, with the recession, we were under the spotlight. Cost savings were needed. And I just saw ahead what was happening, because fracture liaison service was seen as very good practice. But the way things are funded in the NHS, which this is where this was, it didn't actually generate income. The income comes from setting up outpatient clinics and charging the GPs to refer into clinics. It's really quite different. It's quite hard to get my head around the way things work here. It's totally different. Anyway, so we revised the model very quickly, because I could see that what they were doing was asking the nurse specialist to fill in shifts on the ward where there were gaps, and I could see that the service was going to disappear essentially. So we continued to see those, she continued to see those aged 75 and above. Anybody else, we wrote to the dear GP, your patient has had a fracture, please screen or treat for osteoporosis, or if you like, refer back to us. So that was a great success in terms of keeping the service afloat, because they sent back at least half of those, which showed they really need this service. And our income was assured. So we carried on. An audit. What happened to those other 50% who weren't being referred back? Only 10% of them. Our nurse did an audit a few months down the line to find out what happened. So even though we were now a more cost-effective service, we were now actually really doing the population no good because fewer people were being screened and treated. So that provided the business case for a fully funded application to the clinical commissioning group for a whole-time service. That was 2 nurse specialists, an administrator, and 1/5 of 10th of a geriatrician time. And that's really what you need for a service where there's about 220 hip fractures a year. That was needed to look after the non-hips only. If you're going to do this well, that's what you need. And systematic approaches. It's about tackling those people who've had a fragility fracture with the aim of preventing hip fractures. Addressing subsequent falls and fracture risk. And these are the 5 I's that are much quoted in the National Osteoporosis Society in England and the global Capture the Fracture campaign. Your task is to identify these fractures, capture them all. It's no good seeing a small number if you're actually missing lots of others. Investigating them, informing them, and education is crucial here, intervening and integrating, because really the ongoing treatment rests with primary care and with GPs. This is an example of a fracture liaison service in practice. This was Kaiser Permanente Healthy Bones Program. There are multiple examples around the world of this. Okay, so they did a huge mass uptake in screening and treating for osteoporosis. So 30 to 50% reduction in hip fractures across the 11 centres. So if you really tackle this, and Ireland is a suitably small country, that this really is possible to make inroads into reducing fracture numbers here. So in England, as I mentioned, the National Fracture Liaison Database, it started off with a feasibility study in 2014-2015. And this was their most recent publication, and it's the first National Fracture Liaison Database in the world. And I was on the steering group of that for a few years. It's very interesting to watch it start and grow. So this was the headline from this year's report. So 59,000 fracture records admitted in submitted in 1 year. This seems a huge number, and it is. But remember, for every 1 hip fracture, there are about another 5 non-hip fractures. So they still have a lot of groundwork to cover because there are 60,000 hip fractures annually in England. So it's a massive step forward, but dealing with non-hip is the sheer numbers alone make this a very lofty task. So what about fracture liaison in Ireland? This map is the global Capture the Fracture campaign from the International Osteoporosis Foundation. So you can apply and have a star awarded to your service depending on whether you screen all fracture types, whether you follow them up, etc., etc. In Ireland, we're certainly represented with a few stars, no gold star. There are 16 trauma centres. So we have just had funding from 2 pharmaceutical groups, and hopefully we are going to start a national database in Ireland this summer, potentially. The aim will be to look at recording fractures in the picking up all these non-hip fractures. Establishing fracture prevalence is really important because you need to know how many we're picking up. We know the number from HIPE of the admitted patients. We don't really know beyond that. We suspect another 50% that don't get admitted, particularly, for example, with spine fractures. The number is quite unknown. Aiming to address their bone health, address falls risk, and the education piece, so that we'll have 16 gold stars across the country. So there we go. That's my talk on fracture liaison.